Last summer, I did a video judging the strength of Steven Stone, who is best known as the champion of the Hoenn region. I concluded that he was easily one of the strongest champions in the series without being a cheap or ridiculous challenge. I think he was just right for Ruby and Sapphire. But when Pokemon Emerald came out, we got a different champion for the Hoenn region to battle at the end. Wallace. Wallace was the gym leader in Pseudopolis City in Ruby and Sapphire, but he gives the gym back to Juan in Emerald, his mentor. Steven Stone is instead battled as a sort of super boss battle in the Meteor Falls after you've already become champion. This change has always been a little strange, as Emerald is not a sequel to Ruby and Sapphire. It's just the third version. It's not like Black and White 2, where there was a new champion that was previously a gym leader, as it's more of a direct follow-up there. I'm definitely not alone in finding this a little weird in Emerald, but it was never a deal breaker for the game or anything like that. But without delaying any further, let's ask the question, how strong is Wallace? Considering they were both champions in the same generation they made their debut in, I think Steven Stone will make for a direct comparison to see where Wallace's strength as a champion truly stands, especially since we've already gauged where Steven Stone stands in the series. It goes without saying that Wallace's team as a gym leader just doesn't even come close to his team as a champion, so I won't get too in the detail over it, as most fans won't use this to gauge how strong he truly is as a trainer. And it's possible that he's even holding back his team composition somewhat in his role as a gym leader. That being said, he is one of the more fleshed out gym battles, as he's intended to be the 8th and final gym badge you get in Hoenn. That being said, his team is a little weird. His opening Pokemon is Ludicolo. If you've never played any of the Hoenn region games, then you probably don't even believe me, but it's true. There are definitely a few players that got annoyed by Attract in Sweet Kiss since it's still a pretty fast Pokemon. But yeah, it's Ludicolo. Using one in a serious battle is like casually walking up to the chainsaw guy in Resident Evil 4 and saying, "Please kill me." At the very least, it does kind of fit with his flashy and flamboyant personality to try to put that thing in his team. The other two Pokemon he has that aren't on his champion team are Celio and a Seaking. These choices are fairly basic and unthreatening. He has two more Pokemon, but we'll get to those properly when we discuss his champion team. Of course, as you can tell, Wallace is a trainer that specializes in water types specifically. This is a pretty different vibe from Steven, who specializes in more than just one typing. He is most associated with Steel, but he also favors rock and ground types, which fit with his interests in-game. This makes him more diverse as far as typing goes by default. But even by Gen 3, there were an insane amount of water-type Pokemon already, so Wallace has a very large pool of creatures to choose from. Water is also just a solid typing overall, so we can't write off the fact that he's using one typing just yet. Let's take a good look at his champion team in Emerald now. Champion Wallace will open up with our large friend Wailord, a classic Gen 3 water Pokemon for sure. But I'm not sure how appropriate it is for a champion to be using without some seriously crazy strategy behind it. It's got insane HP, but really low defenses. Its attack stats are decent, but the low defenses make its high health feel less imposing than it should. I think the best thing about his Wailord is the fact that it has Rain Dance, at least in my opinion, since it'll set up the rest of his team for a while. Otherwise, there's not too much to say. If your opening Pokemon is slower than Wailord, then I can see it putting you at a bad start to the fight. Getting hit by a max HP water spout is pretty disastrous, so his Wailord isn't a pushover and has its uses, but definitely not the strongest choice he could have gone with. But hey, it's still a million times better than Ludicolo. Next, we've got Tentacruel, and I think this is a great vintage water choice. It's often overlooked how good Tentacruel really is. It's consistently been a respectable Pokemon in every core game it's been in, and the moveset Wallace gives it is actually pretty good too. Hydro Pump, Toxic, Sludge Bomb, and Ice Beam. It could be seen as a little basic or predictable for it to have, but I think it's all pretty solid for an NPC battle. Tentacruel's overall stats are also quite good, with decent HP and excellent special defense. It won't just fall over immediately from most psychic and electric type attacks. 80 special attack and 100 speed are also good to have on top of this too. Not too much else to say here about his Tentacruel, other than I think it's one of his best Pokemon. Even if there's nothing too gimmicky or overpowered about it, it's just good. Wallace's third Pokemon is Ludicolo, which I think is one of the most well-synergized Pokemon in his party, as it isn't weak to typical water weaknesses thanks to its water-grass dual typing, forcing the player to adjust their approach. It's also just another overall good Pokemon in any context, and since his team can have Rain Dance support from Wailord, his Ludicolo can end up pretty scary under the right conditions, especially with its Swift Swim ability. But in gameplay, it's rare that Wallace actually lines up this move perfectly with Ludicolo. It's still probably even better than his Tentacruel in the context of this team thanks to its unique typing. The only thing that's outright worse are its stats. Without Swift Swim, its speed is unremarkable, and everything else outside of special defense is just kind of average. Its moveset is mostly fine. Giga Drain, Leech Seed, Surf, and Double Team. I'm personally not too sure how I feel about Double Team as his fourth move. I think it could have benefited more from something like Ice Beam or having its own Rain Dance to use. But still, it's a pretty good entry on his team, primarily for the dual typing working well with it. Next up, we've got Wiscash. Right off the bat, the type combo of water-ground is excellent, and a huge plus in its favor. It's also got some decent bulk, as this type combo should have. Unfortunately, outside of its HP, most of its stats are kind of middling, with predictably slow speed. The more evened out stat distribution would be okay if its overall base stat total were better, of course, but it's only at 468. And while the dual typing means it only has one weakness, that one weakness is miserable if your opponent has literally any grass move. Sure, it's still got Stab, Earthquake, and Surf at the end of the day, but it's not fast enough to survive most things that can hold a grass attack and take it out. Even a slower Pokemon like Tropius counters it hard, since Wallace's Wiscash has no ice coverage and its Earthquake is useless against it. Amnesia just isn't good enough to protect it, and Hyper Beam feels out of place with its moveset. I guess they didn't want Wallace to have one of the 3 Gen 3 starters on his team, since Swampert would have been an incredible choice here in its place. Wiscash isn't a horrible Pokemon, but it's going to have a tough time on this team, where the player is going to try to make sure to have electric and grass attacks to counter with. The fifth Pokemon to discuss on his team is Gyarados, another one of his Kanto Pokemon alongside Tentacruel. Gyarados is one of those Pokemon that definitely felt like it got a little better going into Generation 3, thanks to the Intimidate ability and new move pull options. And with the moveset of Earthquake, Hyper Beam, Surf, and Dragon Dance, it's mostly just held back by the proper physical special split for some other potential move options it could have gone with. I also think Double Edge or a status attack would have been a better option than Hyper Beam. The Hyper Beam inclusion on Gyarados feels a little bit dated as an option for it in Gen 3. But due to the physical special split, I can see why they did this. Not too much else to say, other than the obvious 4 times weakness to Electric that everyone is going to shoot for the moment they see it. And if Rain Dance isn't up, then there's a fair chance the Electric Pokemon it will face will outspeed it. A common electric Pokemon like Manectric can just show up and end Gyarados with little thought, for example. Outside of that, Gyarados is another good option in a vacuum. Its biggest problem is just, it's on a team where players can prepare themselves for all these water types once they know what they're getting into. And it's easy to take out with water's most common counter. Finally, we have Wallace's ace, Milotic. This is an iconic Pokemon as far as champion battles go, but that's more because of Cynthia than Wallace, and it wasn't even her ace there. Regardless, Milotic is an excellent choice, and therefore a great choice as Wallace's ace. Like Cynthia's Milotic in Gen 4, it has Surf and Ice Beam. Its other 2 moves are Toxic and Recover. With the exception of Mirror Coat, the other 2 options Cynthia uses on Milotic on her Platinum or Diamond and Pearl teams were introduced in Gen 4, and are better for the Pokemon overall. Wallace's options are still good, however, with what he has to work with, even if it looks basic on the surface. If you look up some movesets players like to use for it, you'll actually get similar results too. The problem is you've seen Surf, Ice Beam, and Toxic already. Wallace is a water specialist, and that has some clear flaws. 4 of his 6 Pokemon are weak to electric, and one of the 2 that isn't has a 4 times weakness to grass. It's just not a super optimized team. Most type specialist teams don't usually have 6 Pokemon, and are relegated to gym battles or against a villainous team member or something. And even then, a specialist champion will try to mix it up a little more, like Steven Stone or Lance. Well, at least Wallace doesn't have 3 of the exact same Pokemon to throw at you. It's worth pointing out that his team in the Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is exactly the same as his champion team, but with slightly better and more diverse moveset options. Even the level range is almost exactly the same. However, the resulting experience when you battle him feels almost exactly the same. If anything, it feels easier, since the player will also have new options to take advantage of his entirely water-type team. As usual, Wallace has an anime and manga adaptation, but they don't add too much to the discussion here as far as gauging how strong he really is. In the anime, he's more focused on contests, and he fills that niche more in the story. In the manga, Steven Stone hands over the champion's cloak to Wallace, but the 2 never battle, and the context of why Steven had done so is a little complicated. But let's just say he didn't think he'd have the chance to act as the defending champion with the plans he had in mind at that particular moment. I won't spoil the specifics. The manga doesn't do anything to make him look weak or anything, but as is usually the case with Pokemon Adventures, it's more about his development as a character than his battling prowess. So, how strong is Wallace? Well, as usual, in Universe, he's pretty strong. He is the champion in Emerald after all. But for the players to deal with gameplay-wise, he's alright. He's definitely nowhere near as strong as Steven Stone, and overall isn't as hard to deal with as several other major trainer battles and champions. Obviously, having every Pokemon be water type in some way is the glaring issue here, as well as not having enough diversity in the moves chosen for each of his Pokemon. Though, there's only so much you can do when you're dedicated to just using water types. But that being said, he's definitely not the easiest champion either. For one, his Pokemon level range in Emerald is 55 to 58, and it's likely many players will be a little underleveled going in, but not to nearly the same dramatic extent as the Gen 1 champion battle. But if you want to factor in something like that, he's obviously still going to be more challenging than some of the other later champions in this series, like Diantha, by a decent margin. But it only matters so much when he's focused on being a monotype trainer with mostly consistent weaknesses without diverse enough coverage to try to make up for it. Still, 4 out of 6 Pokemon I think are pretty strong on their own, and the other 2 aren't terrible either. So I do think Wallace deserves some respect for being able to pull off a water-only champion team to a certain extent, even if it's also what holds him back severely. He's a bit hard to rank, but I'd put him somewhere in the middle of the pack as far as champions are concerned, but probably still toward the lower half of them. Unfortunately, he's replacing Steven Stone as Hoenn's champion for the game's 3rd version, and that means he's usually viewed unfavorably. I can't tell you how many comments would say something like, "Steven Stone may break my bones, but Wallace will never hurt me." People just weren't impressed. But personally, I don't really mind Emerald having a different champion in Wallace, since you still can have the post-game battle against Steven Stone, where he uses the same exact champion team for Ruby and Sapphire, but instead being from level 75 to 78. But what do you think? Do you like Wallace as a champion? What was your experience like battling him as a champion? How about his gym team? Do you think he's underrated, or is his reputation warranted? How do you feel about his characterization throughout the franchise, even outside just the games? Let me know down below. We're finally here in 2023, and I'm super excited for what this year has to offer us. There's potential DLC for Scarlet and Violet on the horizon, and who knows just what else Game Freak may have up their sleeves. It's going to be really exciting times coming up for a Pokemon fan. If you're interested in more Mystic content, check out my TikTok and Mystic Umbreon Shorts YouTube channel. I've got a really fun series starting up there very soon, and of course, have a weekly edition of my Should You Use series focusing on Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. Also, if you're into fanfictions and what ifs, check out Mystic Reads. I offer a ton of creative spoken word content on there, so come join me. Thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you all next time.